Hey everyone, this is Hanney Seylim. Today I've got a really distinguished guest with me today, somebody that I admire for such a long time, and I've read pretty much every single book that he wrote. And I'm very, very thrilled to be discussing with him today issues of skepticism, faith, and science. Um, Hello, Dr. Shermer. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Nice to see you.
Great to see you.
Looks
Great to
like
see you.
you're floating around in the solar system. Where's
Indeed.
the flat Earth? The Earth looks round there. That's very inaccurate.
Well, one of the things we're going to be talking about is flat Earth and its theory. But I really wanted. I mean, I've seen you introduced by multiple channels and multiple areas in so many different ways, and I don't want to impose. And I think I want to allow for the evolution of characters, because I've seen you introducing yourself as well in different ways throughout the years. But what is the latest version of Dr. Michael Shermer now?
The latest version, yeah, 3.9. Yes, well, I guess I mean, my day job is the publisher of Skeptic magazine. It looks like the latest issue, In the Beginning. It's a quarterly, so Skeptic is a quarterly publication. It's available anywhere in the world. We're in every bookstore in North America, but like everybody else, we've gone digital now, and you can access it at skeptic.com. And we have subscribers all over the world, particularly in the Arab world, where my books are being translated as we speak, along with those of Richard Dawkins and others, like I think Dan Dennett, Sam Harris, a few others, because, well, we need skeptical, critical thinking everywhere on the planet. So, and then on top of that, I have my own podcast, The Michael Shermer Show, and I'm a professor at Chapman University. Just one class per semester, called Skepticism 101, How to Think Like a Scientist. And then I write my books, and that's pretty much it. Otherwise, I'm riding my bike and playing with my 5-year-old son and just enjoying life.
Well, this is brilliant. Well, I want to really start with an area that pretty much I think most of the time you identify with. You kind of don't like the label of atheist agnostics, because it sort of puts you in a very narrow spectrum. You always prefer the skeptic sort of title. But what I want to start with is the difference between skepticism and cynicism, because these two, especially in the Arabic world where Islam is quite dominant, words like doubt and investigations are quite horrible. They actually have negative attributes. It's sort of akin to the devil, Satan. You shouldn't be doubting. Even in Christianity, doubting isn't a great thing. But why is skepticism is a good way to live one's life?
Yes. Well, first of all, the word skepticism has nothing to do with cynicism. Skeptic and cynic are completely unrelated. I think people got that idea because skeptics tend to challenge most ideas, because most ideas are wrong, and therefore they should be challenged. And not just religious ideas, but also scientific ideas. We only hear about the right ones that end up in textbooks, but for every right one, there's hundreds of wrong hypotheses that never make the grade. So that's why we should be skeptical. And maybe that sounds cynical, and so therefore the word gets thrown in there. Or maybe it's because they sort of sound alike, but not really. I'm not really sure about that. But in terms of the Arab world or any kind of religious truth, I see these as largely different kind of truths than empirical scientific truths. Not that they should be, but that they are. They're treated that way. That is to say, the truths in religions are already known. There's no point in searching for the truth, other than what does the Holy Book say, and what's the proper interpretation of what the Holy Book says, because the truth is in there. And if you start off with that premise, the problem is that what if you pick the wrong one? Because it's pretty clear, even to fundamentalists in any religion, there are others who don't agree with you. So if you're a Christian who accept the resurrection of Jesus, and you better, because what's the point of being a Christian? You should just not be a Jew or a Muslim or nothing. And yet Jews and Muslims who believe in the same God, the God of Abraham, Yahweh, and even accept much of the same holy text, at least the Old Testament for Jews, and both testaments for Christians, and part of it for Muslims, plus the Quran and so forth. Well, they're pretty close. If you were an anthropologist from Mars, you would lump all three of those religions. In fact, scholars do. They call them the Abrahamic religions. Those are the big three. And yet clearly they disagree fundamentally on huge issues. And so, to that extent, you see what's unfolding as we record this today on Saturday, May, 14th, that there's, bloodshed in the Middle East there, Israel and Palestinians in Gaza and so forth. The problem here is you have two different peoples who have one deed to the same piece of land, or they have two deeds to the same piece of land, each of which, instead of having, say, a title company, as you do with real estate, settle the dispute, where you go to court and a judge makes a decision about who owns the land, or whatever the dispute is. Here, there is no place to go. The court is in heaven, and the court is God, and each religion claims to have direct access to God, and each of them says, well, God told me this is my piece of land. And, well, how is that going to be settled? Well, historically, we know how that's usually settled. Before the 20th century, or maybe say before the mid-20th century, this was all settled through conflict, through war. That's largely what wars did. Not just resource competition, but also land, territory, redrawing the lines. And it's only in the last 50 years or so that we've gotten used to the idea that the line should stay the same. You don't get to redraw them and grab a hunk for your own. And when that does happen, it's quite rare, like when Putin grabbed Crimea, that was pretty rare. Now, no one did anything about it. Obama said, that was really bad, and I'm going to draw the line in the sand. Well, what are you going to do? Nothing. And, that's the problem when you have nuclear weapons and you escalate up close to it. Obama himself, to his own, kind of bellicose chiefs of staff, who were joint chiefs of staff, were saying we should do something. And, basically he said, what do you want me to do? Use nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and to stop Putin? Who thinks we should do that? And of course, nobody raised their hand, right? So it's unlikely that Israel will escalate to nuclear weapons. They don't even admit that they have them, although we know they do. But still, you can see how these things get resolved through conflict. And again, it's because there's no agreement on how to determine what's true about a sacred value like holy land. And if it was treated like anything else, where you gather empirical evidence or you make rational arguments, and then in this case it would be something like a court of the UN or something to settle the dispute. No one's going to do that because they don't think that they are dealing with an empirical truth. They think it's a holy truth, and they have the right one, and there's no discussion. And therefore, I have no idea what the solution is to this problem. I mean, how are you and I going to figure this out when, every president since Eisenhower hasn't been able to resolve the conflict, and, professional ambassadors and diplomats and people that do this for a living, no one has been able to, maintain a long peace there. So, and ultimately it comes down to those different kinds of truths, empirical truths versus religious truths.
Yeah. Well, you see, my take on this particular subject, and we'll get into a different one in a moment, but the Palestinian conflict. The Israeli one had to use the promise from God, the God of Abraham, but the Palestinians didn't need to drag the war into a religious war. It would have sufficed if they just approached us legally. They were in the land beforehand and refuse to engage in any religious conversation and leave it within the legal United Nations systems and leave it at that. Mm-hmm. But invoking another religious angle to this made it impossible to settle. You're right. Who's going to settle this? The judge in the sky? I think it was clumsy and it was very unstrategic from their part.
Yeah, and historically, this is how it's always been done. You just grab a piece of land that you want to make your own. And if somebody challenges you, well, then you go to war over it. I'm sitting here in Southern California. I live in Santa Barbara. Well, this land used to belong to Native Americans called the Chumash people. They probably didn't call themselves that, but that's what the original Spanish missionaries called them when they came here. And so we just took it. And who's we? Well, originally Mexico. I'm sitting on what used to be Mexico, and then we took it. We, the United States, over some debt and then a conflict or whatever. And that's just kind of how it goes. And if Native Americans said, well, we want it back, or if Mexico said, well, we want it back, it's like, well, it's not going to happen. Sorry, it's been too long. And, we got bigger guns. That's how it goes, historically. And again, there's no good conclusion to that other than, at some point you just say, okay, we're drawing the lines, no more changing the borders. And then somebody like Putin says, well, I'm going to just take this one little thing. Or China says, well, we're going to just create some islands here in the South China Sea and call them part of China. And then, everybody goes, oh, you can't do that. Well, okay, stop us. And if you're somebody the size of China, then you probably get away with it. If you're smaller, you probably can't get away with it. Like when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait for the oil, and we didn't need a coalition, but it's better to have a coalition through the UN. So we said, no, you can't do that, and we're going to put a stop to that. Anyway, so this is a long roundabout way of how disputes get settled if they can be done empirically better, and if you can't agree on what the evidence is, then a judge has to decide.
Yeah. And obviously you go to a different realm, like in Europe, where countries like Belgium and Holland is divided by a strait, or like I can see Homer Simpson jumping between the two countries. One of his, and life is quite normal, and there will be probably no possibility of war in a future war. But I want to take this back into the conversation where we started talking about cynicism, skepticism, and why we should think things through before we start believing in them. And every time I think about ontology, I end up with epistemology, because ontology, even if you're trying to understand yourself, your essence, you'll have to engage your senses, and it has to come via information. I think epistemology always trumps, because you're trying to figure things out, and therefore epistemology will always be dominant. But what is the epistemic sources of your knowledge? If we're going to rely on senses, we know the eternal conversation, the Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and what can we trust? Can we trust our senses to make sense of the world around us?
Yeah. So, well, of course, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a psychologist, social scientist, and historian. So I come at it from a kind of a practical point of view. There is no ontology without epistemology. I do assume reality sitting out there, whether I'm looking at it or not, or even if I'm alive or not. The moon's not going to disappear when I'm gone, much less the rest of the universe. But to what extent I can know something about it? Well, yes, of course, that requires senses and interpretation of information that's coming in and whatnot. So that then gets to epistemology. How do you know what you know? And of course, that's a huge field. Essentially, I take kind of a scientific, kind of a combination of a Popperian falsification and a Bayesian reasoning. That is, we do two things. We try to falsify or refute ideas that people have, or we ourselves have. And if they're not refuted or not falsified, then that doesn't make them right, but it makes them less likely to be wrong, which is moving in the right direction. And then in terms of like a Bayesian analysis, pushing in the positive direction, we have these priors about to what extent this hypothesis is true or not based on different evidence. And then as we gather more evidence, the priors change. They go up or down. And that makes the credence of the believability or the likelihood of it being true, the theory or hypothesis, goes up or down based on how we change the priors. And so there, I think in the positive direction, we can gain more confidence, not just from ideas not being falsified, but gathering more evidence. So if you take something like the theory of evolution, when Darwin published in 1859, the burden of proof was on him. The creationist model was the one everybody accepted, even most scientists, because, what other options are there? So Darwin gave an option. He said, well, here's a theory that explains design from the bottom down, rather than from the bottom up, rather than the top down. And the one reason he took so long to publish his book, I mean, it was, about over 20 years, about 24 years, 23 years since he returned from the voyage of the Beagle before he published, was because if you don't have a good theory, there were other theories of evolution, but they weren't very good and no one accepted them. They rejected them. So he wanted to have a massive amount of evidence, and he did. And he showed from multiple lines of evidence that, this thing is true, and true with a small t. And so over the course of, the last 150 years or so, we've just gathered steam. It has stood the test of falsification, and in a Bayesian way, many, many independent lines of inquiry point to the same conclusion. So our confidence is very high. And, that's kind of how science works. That's in the good way. There are other areas where it's not so obvious. There's no explanation for consciousness, say, or the origins of life, or the origins of the universe. Not that there aren't ideas, there are, and some really good ideas. We just haven't reached consensus, like we have the theory of evolution, or say climate science, climate change, anthropogenic global warming. The consensus on that, right? So that's a kind of a good way of thinking about reliable knowledge that it's reasonable to accept. Not just that you have confidence, but others who are expert in the field, if they have a consensus and they've been competitive with each other, trying to debunk each other, and running experiments and gathering data and testing ideas and so on, if it stands the test of time, there's a pretty good chance it's probably true. And therefore you can offer your provisional assent. And of course you can withdraw it at any time if the evidence changes. And that's how I think of knowledge in a more pragmatic way. Not pragmatic,
Right.
Pragmatism, but practical, scientific way.
Yes, we eventually have to yield to being practical, because this is the reality we live in, and we have to make use of the life where we're having. It's a one life opportunity. I'm very glad that you brought up Charles Darwin, because as I said to you before when we were off air, I've been listening to your 25 hours on Audible, beautiful lectures, and they're very natural, and I love the interaction with your students, and some of them were professors themselves in their own right. But I found that you had your dissertation, you wanted to, everybody was talking about Darwin, everybody interested in Darwin, but you were obviously the psychological background, you're interested in interesting people, and Alfred Wallace, the character of a heretic, and the final analogy where the order of your birth dictates how easy are you accept or entertain new and wacky ideas. Does that put the free will proposition at a further scrutiny, that you obviously don't choose your order of birth or your social status?
Yeah. Okay. So there you're referencing my biography of Alfred Russel Wallace. That was my doctoral dissertation. The original title was going to be Heretic Scientist, since you referenced that, and I love that title. But the publisher, Oxford University Press, they preferred In Darwin's Shadow. We got to have Darwin in there. It's like, yeah, but in Darwin's shadow, that's kind of the point. He's in the shadow. Let's get him out of the shadow. Yeah, but whatever. Anyway, it's all right. Yeah, well, I called him a heretic scientist because he was very open-minded, probably too open-minded. So here I use the big five personality dimensions, OCEAN, OCEAN, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So Wallace was, and so how do I know? Because he's dead. He's been dead since 1913. How would I know what his personality is like? Well, I had professional Wallace biographers take the big five personality dimension as if it was him. So instead of like these questions ask, I see myself as someone who is, instead of that, I would say, I see Alfred Russel Wallace as somebody who was, and so on. Then they would answer the question. And so I did that. And then I ran an iterative reliability between the different biographers, and got a pretty consistent personality profile of the man. Not just what I think, but what other people who know him professionally as scholars think. And, his high openness to experience, his sort of lower to middle conscientiousness, very high agreeableness, that is easygoing, open, and friendly with everybody. And, that made him probably too open-minded to radical ideas like phrenology, seances, spiritualism. A lot of the ideas that he pioneered, like natural selection, biogeography, and some work he did in anthropology that was quite pioneering, just game-changing for science. And, he's one of the giants. But on the other hand, where he was very open to like attending seances and being just blatantly, openly fooled by these con artists, Darwin and Huxley were just flabbergasted that he would even bother to go and do these crazy things because they knew it was bullshit. And why? Because they didn't suffer fools gladly. They were more cynical. There's that word, or skeptical of of these kinds of forces being out there. They didn't think it was true, and therefore I think the characteristics that made Wallace a successful scientist also made him more susceptible to pseudoscience. So that's what I was doing with that book. Of course, you can think about this, apply it to anybody. I did this same kind of thing with Stephen Jay Gould and Carl Sagan. I had people that knew them or know them, and take the Big Five personality inventory as if it was them, and did the same thing. Both Carl and Steve were, high in openness to experience, but also very high in conscientiousness, very low in agreeableness. They didn't suffer fools gladly. They were very skeptical of these kinds of things. And anyway, so it's an interesting way to think about to what extent you should be open-minded. Well, you should. We don't want to be so close-minded you miss all the new interesting ideas. If you were that way, you wouldn't accept quantum physics, for example, because it's crazy. But in fact, the people that do this for a living professionally, they tell us there's something to it. So, okay. And anyway, so that's just kind of a way to think. But in terms of free will, oh boy, I don't know if you want to go down this road. I'm not a determinist. I'm a compatibilist. I do think we have volition. Mm-hmm. I think we make choices. I think being aware of the causal net that it surrounds our personal lives, that nudges us one way or the other, we have some choice in interacting with that causal net and changing it as we go forward. So while I see the past as determined, I don't see the future as predetermined. I'm not a predeterminist. I think we can alter it as we go, and I think we do. And in any case, it doesn't really matter because every determinist I know acts like they have free will. They don't get up out of bed in the morning and walk around like a pinball in a pinball game, bouncing around from one place to another, not bothering to look before they cross the street. I mean, they act like they're making choices. So that's how I think about that.
I actually kind of agree with you, Dr. Shermer, because the conversation about your even when you make a choice, your brain has already made that choice 5 seconds before you've made it. But I think there is no invisible power or forces making that decision for you. It could possibly be your subconscious or unconscious mind, which is, it is still you. It is part of you that is undiscovered.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And you have free won't. You can jump in and override, the motor cortex that was about to pick A. You go, no, I'm going to go B. You do this or that. Now, determinists would say, yeah, but it's still, some determining factor back in the causal sequence leading to you changing your mind. Yeah, but I'm aware of this. We have more degrees of freedom than, say, dogs do, or squirrels, or cockroaches, or whatever.
Yeah, and I remember a very interesting conversation in one of your lectures with one of the students who was also a professor, and you've talked about intellectual indoctrination, where we all have biases. We come with biases. The trick is to eventually be aware of them and understand them, and don't let them rule you and sort of expose them. It's almost like exposing your subconscious eventually, and being able to face up to it and understand the underlying conditions of your reality. So that one of the conversations was leading towards, well, we all have our biases, just understand them, examine them, and let the scientific method which we devised protect us from our own biases. What do you think about that angle?
It helps, but research on this is debiasing programs that teach people about cognitive biases, confirmation bias and hindsight bias and my side bias and so on. There's dozens of them. And they become better at identifying biases in other people. But there's also a bias. That is, I'm blind. Sometimes it's called blindside bias. I'm blind to my own biases. And so while I may better understand how the confirmation bias works in your brain, I'm less likely to see it in my own. If anything, I'll say, thank goodness I'm not subject to that one, but that sucker is. It's almost like that Homer Simpson episode where he's about to go on a drinking binge and Marge tries to nudge him out of that. And he says, oh, that's because he's going to get sick and feel terrible the next day. And he goes, that's future Homer's problem, that sucker. In a way that get back to the free will thing, in a way we do have multiple selves. There's the current me and then there's the future me. And I know what future me is going to be like because I have, in my case, 66 years of experience with me. And I know what my propensities are. So I know I better set the alarm if I'm going to get up tomorrow, because when I get up tomorrow, I'm not going to want to get up, and on and on and on. And so we all have a future self, and how to nudge the future self down one pathway rather than the other pathway. And that's what I'm talking about with volition. You're making choices for future you.
Right. Now we go to the subject of God and pareidolia, detecting agency and intention and everything. It has been a very useful characteristic in our evolution, and it probably helped us survive. And probably we are the offspring of those who chose this trait and became the dominant trait. That sort of give rise to us as being of their offspring. However, continuing with that particular trait, after we've sort of secured we can now go behind the trees to know, even without going there physically, to know if the rustling in the trees, is it the wind or is it an animal, without having to risk ourselves. Do you reckon this character of the human evolution that helped us survive the previous centuries still beneficial to humans, or it's time to let go?
Well, you can't let go because it's not a bug in the system; it's a feature, as people say, analogous with computers. Well, pareidolia is a good word, but it means the misperception of something, the thinking there's a pattern there when it's not there. Okay, so the reason I coined the word patternicity, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless noise, is that sometimes the patterns are real. There's a reason we find patterns. It's called association learning. You connect A to B, and often A is connected to B, causally connected. Not always. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. How do you know? Well, we have to make these kind of Bayesian probabilistic calculations. And when we do that, it's better if it's a high-risk situation where the knowledge could indicate something threatening, it's better to err on the side of making a false positive. That is a type 1 error. Assume that the rustle in the grass is a dangerous predator and not just the wind, because that's more likely to save you rather than assuming the rustle in the grass is just the wind. It turns out it's a dangerous predator, your lunch. That second one would be a type 2 error, or a false negative. So my argument, I made this argument in detail in The Believing Brain, is that that in our long history, natural selection would have created the propensity to make more type 1 errors than type 2 errors. So superstition, magical thinking, thinking that things are connected, there's patterns everywhere, there's hidden agents behind forces, and so on. That's natural, that's normal, that's kind of part of the package of cognition. You can't really get rid of it. And and all you can do is kind of redirect around it, which is what science education is trying to do. And but again, with pareidolia and other such words, they just mean it in the negative way. I'm saying that it could go either way, and we should, again, you have to kind of keep an open mind in case the patterns might be real. I mean, just think of what science is. Climate change, this connection between CO2 gases and temperature increases. That's a pattern. Okay, so patternicity says, "Ooh, I think I see a pattern," and it wasn't clear for a while whether it was a causal connection or not, whether that pattern was real or not. Now we're reasonably confident that it is, but any science could go that way, and so that's I've been thinking about that recently because I just finished up a book on conspiracy theories. Why do people believe them? Well, one reason is because a lot of them are true, right? A conspiracy theory is a kind of pattern. And, so there's a patternicity there, connecting the dots. I think there's a pattern. And then agenticity, that the idea that there's a hidden agent behind the pattern, pulling the strings and so on. This is what a conspiracy theory is. So one reason people believe them is they make more type 1 errors out of caution. I call this constructive conspiracism. That is, probably better to assume that most patterns of conspiracy theories are true, just in case they are, because we know that people often connive and to cheat the system, to do immoral things to other people, corporations, government agencies, and so on. A day doesn't go by where there isn't some big newspaper headline about some insider trading on Wall Street, some corrupt politician, some major corporation that did something like Volkswagen cheating the emission standards in Europe, and so on. This kind of stuff happens all the time. And you'd have to be a naive fool to think, well, all conspiracy theories are fake. They're all false. No, they're not. We know that there's a lot of them that turn out to be real. Assassination of Lincoln was a conspiracy. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand that launched the First World War by Serbian nationalists, this guy, Princip, that killed him. That was a conspiracy. It was absolutely a secret cabal that was planned for months in advance and so on. Watergate, Iran-Contra, the Pentagon Papers, and to what extent the government was doing shenanigans behind the scenes, illegal, immoral, whatever, related to the Vietnam War, WikiLeaks, and all the things that Bush and even Obama were doing, surveillance of American citizens without warrants, even surveillance of foreign leaders like Angela Merkel. Like, what? Does Congress know about this? I mean, did we approve? Who signed off on this? That's a kind of conspiracy, right? So let's see. Sorry, I just lost you there for a second. There we go. So my argument is that one reason among many, but this is like the central core one, is that, and again, it's a feature, not a bug in our cognition, to be conspiratorially minded, is that enough of them are true. It probably paid in our past to assume that there are secret goings-ons with other people, other groups are risky, are dangerous. We should be cautious. And so I call that constructive conspiracism. I think there's enough to it there. And then you can layer on other psychological factors there. Anyway, sorry.
No, indeed. Sorry, I kind of definitely agree on this point here. But these actions are perpetrated by human conniving. There's nothing supernatural. There are people acting in the real world, doing real things. However, there are claims of the paranormal, the parapsychological, the supernatural. We know the James Randi Prize has been around for a quarter of a century, never been claimed. Another 31 different prizes sort of up for grabs. Nobody is able to claim them because they are under strong scrutiny and testing mechanism to verify whether there is a supernatural realm. Have you experienced any of that during your debunking years?
Well, first, let's make a distinction of the different kinds of weird things or fringe beliefs or whatever we're talking about, because they're not all paranormal and supernatural. So skeptics, we deal with a lot of different topics. Say Bigfoot, for example. or UFOs. This is not paranormal. There's nothing paranormal about it or supernatural. I mean, if it turned out there was another bipedal primate, that's just biology. There either is or there isn't, and we don't need any special laws of physics to explain that. Same thing with aliens visiting Earth or being out there. These are two different questions, but we know from enough from research in astronomy and cosmology that it would be astonishing if we were the only life forms in the entire universe. I mean, there's trillions and trillions of Earth-sized planets in the universe. Just hundreds of millions of them, Earth-sized planets in our galaxy alone. It would be stunning if we were the only ones. Of course, that doesn't mean that they've come here, of course. But there's nothing paranormal about it. That's a purely natural argument. Now, something like ESP, astrology, perpetual motion machines, there's a bunch in that cohort that would require some different kind of physics. And sometimes people that study consciousness go in this direction, looking for maybe some quantum physics explanation for consciousness. And but even so, that would still put it in the realm of physics. If it was true. I don't think it's true, but there's this theory by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff that has to do with the microtubule structures inside neurons, in which supposedly the warm, wet environment can still enable the collapse of the wave function inside the subatomic particles in the atoms inside these neurons to do something and synchronize with your neurons firing. And therefore what? I can read your mind. I can be conscious. I can, it's some giant quantum field, and we're all connected psychically, mentally, ESP, take your pick. Okay. If it turned out that was true, I don't think it is, but if it was, that wouldn't be that wouldn't be paranormal. That would just make it part of the natural world. It would just be part of physics and neuroscience or whatever. And so here I go so far as to say there's no such thing as the paranormal or the supernatural. There's just the normal, the natural, and the stuff we can't explain yet. And at some point, we'll have a natural explanation for the mystery, or the mystery will just go away. It was never a mystery in the first place. It's just a misunderstanding, miscalculation of probabilities, and misunderstanding of the law of large numbers, and so forth. And therefore, I would even apply that to God. I mean, if it turned out we discovered, most theists won't agree with me on this, but if it turned out we found an entity that, for all intents and purposes, compared to us, was omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, say, we would call it God, but it would just be a super advanced extraterrestrial intelligence able to, maybe create life forms, manufacture planets out of massive geoengineering projects, or, even create new universes out of collapsing black holes. This isn't my idea, but Michio Kaku's toyed with this idea, as have some cosmologists. Who talk, kind of create science fiction scenarios of how this could happen. Well, that would just be what primitive people would call God. But if we knew the technology, we would call it the technology, or the ETI, or whatever, the intelligent designer of creationists. Essentially, that's what they're describing, although they don't personally think that's what it is. They think it's God outside of space and time, operating on some other plane, not under the control of the natural laws of the universe. So that would be different. But my response to that is, then how do you know? If it's outside of space and time and has nothing to do with the natural world, then how do you know? Because we're physical, three-dimensional beings in a space-time universe, physical universe. Okay. And in any case, if God intervenes in the world to perform miracles, say, how does he do it? How does he reach from outside of space-time, wherever that is, to stir the particles in some way, to cure somebody's cancer, to deflect the football in the Super Bowl because he prefers one team over the other, or whatever your belief is about miracles? How does God do that? And this is the same challenge I have for ghost hunters. Ghosts are supposed to be these non-material, incorporeal, pure energy things. Well, or maybe disembodied souls. Well, how does the ghost know to turn right at the end of the hallway and open the door? How does it open the door anyway? You have to have some kind of physical, and then it knocks the painting off the wall to spook you at 2 a.m. How does it do that? I can knock a painting off the wall, but I got to slap it with a physical. Well, okay, how does a ghost do it? Right. So this is a problem for any of those kinds of paranormal supernatural theories.
Well, one of the most entertaining debates you've ever engaged in, and I honestly probably watched it about 25 times. Every time I need intellectual stimulation as well as a bit of comedy, honestly, I watch it. And it's the conversation between you, Sam Harris, Deepak Chopra, and Gene Houston.
Yeah.
This was incredible to me. And I think it looks like that agency detection is not letting go. So there's a lot of, this is a new thing that's been happening at the moment. People are abandoning the Abrahamic faith now, thinking, oh, that's a bit ridiculous now. But it's still going to be something. And it has to be a bit scientific. Quantum mechanics is a bit mysterious, a bit spooky. It looks like this could be the fingers of God here. So, but that conversation where Deepak is obviously flashing some scientific terminologies with a little bit of a spooky mythicism, and completely missing the point, or not understanding the actual theory. How did you see that conversation from within?
Oh, well, yeah, that was pretty fun. There's a backstory to that. Deepak had long wanted to do a debate with me, and we were just going to do a one-on-one debate at Caltech, and then he knew somebody at ABC Nightline, and said, "Hey, you want me to get ABC Nightline to televise it?" Like, yeah, that'd be great. And but then they got on board and said, "Well, we're worried that a one-on-one might be kind of boring. Let's make it a 2-on-2, like a team tag wrestling match, right?" So Deepak and I each got to pick our tag team member, and I picked Sam, who lives in Southern California here. So, and we were friends. And Deepak, I thought for sure he'd get some quantum physicist or some professional scientist, because he's not a physicist, he's a medical doctor. But instead, he got this Gene Houston, who I'd never heard of, and she's kind of I don't know what she is, kind of a new age spiritual guru or something. And so I thought her contribution, wasn't particularly helpful to his side. And since then, I've noticed he's done a number of debates in which he has this quantum physicist at his side, because that lends more credibility. In any case, I thought it was a useful discussion, because in the Q&A, Leonard Mlodinow, the physicist from Caltech, was there in the audience. Len and I are good friends, and so in the Q&A, he stood up and said, "Deepak, you don't know what you're talking about with quantum physics. Would you like me to give you a master class in it?" And to his credit, Deepak said, "Yeah, I would love that. Let's have a conversation." So they did, and they ended up doing a book together called The War of the Worldviews that outlines perfectly where their differences are. And I should add, Len, even though we're good friends and he's a skeptic and so forth, but he's not hostile to religion or New Age beliefs at all. This is not his thing. It's not what he does. So, so for someone like Deepak, he has to just make the case purely on the evidence. It's not like, if he came to me, he could say, "Oh, Shermer, you're just too close-minded. If you were more open-minded, you'd see I'm right." He can't say that to Len, because Len is open-minded. He has no particular, this isn't his day job to debunk these kinds of things, right? So in any case, that was an interesting experience. I do think it comes down, like between Deepak and I, and I've written about this, because we've gotten to know each other pretty well. It comes down kind of a foundational worldview that dictates your epistemology and your ontology. And from there, we just diverge. And so you take it back to that point. And, I'm a monist. He's a monist. I thought he was a dualist. He's not a dualist. He doesn't think there's mind and body. He thinks there's just mind. I think there's just body. I think the mind is a product of the body, the brain. He thinks it's all consciousness, everything. And that the material world is just a, sort of a subcategory of consciousness that comes into being and then disappears. Let's say human life, and because when I ask him, "Where does the soul go after I die? Where do I go?" He said, "You return to where you were before you were born." It's like, where is that? In the quantum conscious field or whatever. Okay, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that's kind of the idea that consciousness is the ground of all being, as Deepak says. He borrows that from Tillich's conception of God. God is the ground of all being. You can't ask, well, where's God? Everything is God. but he doesn't mean that quite in a pantheistic way. It's a more personal God way, but that God is so other, so different, that there's no language we can have to properly describe it. So we just have words. Okay. So at that point you just go, well, where do we go from here? The conversation just kind of grinds to a halt.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you see, let's take this one down to reality. So we can have that beautiful philosophical conversation about God and ontology and epistemology, but the reality is beliefs inform actions, and actions have consequences. Stuff on the ground. We are talking no longer just about a God who's created the universe. We're talking about a God who's requiring you to do certain things in terms of diet, in terms of the way you have sex, in terms of the way you treat people. So this is now real stuff. Do you think science will have effect on morality? Do you think science can inform morality?
Yes, of course, I do. But first, just back up for a second, because I think you make a really important point there. Most people are religious and go to church or synagogue or mosque or whatever for personal, emotional, social reasons that have nothing to do with any of these arguments we're talking about. I mean, a bunch of us eggheads sitting around talking about quantum physics and the prime mover and the cosmological constant and the fine tuning of the universe, and this indicates God's exist, blah blah blah. Most people don't care about any of that. They're going there, their friends are going there, their family goes there. The community is kind of centered around this church or synagogue or mosque. They go there for inspiration every week. A reminder to be a good person, and don't forget, we got to help man the soup kitchen. And here's we're taking donations for Aunt Mary's cancer, and we're gonna help the community by donating to the homeless shelter, and now we're all gonna sing, and then we're gonna have food afterwards, and it's free parking. I mean, it's just like this whole social thing that has nothing to do with the intellectual side of things. And so the idea that well, if we just gave them a copy of The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, they would give up their religion. Okay, well, some people do that are not so socially committed to religion, and maybe they live in their heads and they like to think about those kinds of arguments, but most people are not like that. They don't care about those arguments. And so in part, one of the reasons for the rise of the nuns and the decline of religiosity, although I'd like to have skeptics take credit for that. In fact, I think it's more of a social, political, cultural shift over many decades about women going more in the workforce, and it's women who decide whether their families go to church or not more than men. That's one factor. Also, governments picking up the social kind of contingency that religions provided, helping the poor and manning the soup kitchens and those sorts of things. Government social programs that are designed to help people that need help. That means you don't need to do it. Your church doesn't need to do it. The government's doing it. Of course, in America, we're not too keen on that, but Northern European countries that have tight social safety nets, like, Norway and Germany and France and Sweden and so on, they've seen massive drops in religiosity. And one explanation is because they don't really need religion. Religion used to provide an explanation for the world, but science does that now, and so we don't need it for that. And now, if governments are taking care of poor people and so on, then what's there to do with religion? What's it got to do? Not as much, right? So now to your final point, will it be replaced? I don't know. Maybe. There's a long-standing debate in humanist, skeptical, atheist circles about to what extent we need to replace religion with something like a secular religion that is built, some kind of center in every city where people can go once a week and have kind of secular services. There's a bunch of these examples, like Unitarian Universalist churches that become that. The Ethical Society in New York City did these. There's these Sunday, what are they called? Sunday meetups. like here in LA, where they meet every Sunday and they light candles and they sing hymns to Newton and they have testimonials about how people lost their religion. It's kind of amusing. Okay. And, I've gone a few times. It's kind of fun. But the idea that that religion needs to be replaced, I'm not sure that that's the case. The implication is that we have kind of a God module in the brain, or a religion neural network that has to be met. I don't think that's really a good argument, because religion is too big a category. It fills too many different things that could be filled elsewhere. Social capital, having friends and family, having hobbies and things to do with other people. We've seen during the pandemic how important that is. And, religion's not the only game in town to do that. And and now there's plenty of secular services for weddings and funerals and things like that, you can design your own. That's what people are doing now. And so I'm not sure we need an official top-down organized secular religion and call it something else, secular humanism, or I prefer Enlightenment humanism, but whatever you call it. I'm not sure we need a top-down organization with a head and a committee and buildings and so on. I'm not sure that's where we're going.
Yeah. I've never been a fan of top-down systems anyway. They tend to fail because I think bottom-up is always the way to go, because that's how you really change. It's a bit slower and people don't have the patience for them, but they are long-standing. Top-down, even we see Saudi Arabia now changing some of its policies. It's lovely to see, but what it needs is another ruler to come and reverse that. And here we go. It's Turkey again, or some other country again. I'm always wary of this. The one thing that I was going to point out, I had recently a conversation with Mandisa Thomas, the president of Black Non-Believers. And we were talking about the enslavement of the Black people over the Atlantic slave trade, and how they were not supposed to be able to read and write or learn, but they were confined into churches. That's the only sort of simulation they had. Obviously imposed on them, it wasn't a religion. But somehow, even though it was perceived to be the religion of the white man and should be then abhorred for that particular reason, the story of Exodus, the Moses situation, has actually inspired them to ignite their. So this is how complex religion can be, because at the end of the day, it's human literature, and human literature can be powerful if we look at it that way. And because a lot of people think atheists or skeptics or agnostics, that we want the demolition of texts and we should burn them all. Study them.
I encourage people to read the Bible. I mean, first of all, there is some great literature that came out of the Bible, just like with Shakespeare, and so we should always be well versed in rich literature, for sure, for a whole variety of reasons, and the Bible would definitely need to be included in that. Now, in terms of which text we use for constructing a moral system, well, that's why I wrote this book, The Moral Arc. You asked about science and morality. Of course, I argue we don't need religion. In fact, we should probably jettison most of it, because it hasn't been very helpful for most modern moral issues. And in fact, most of the moral progress over the last several centuries, I claim, comes from secular forces operating. Even if you take someone like the Quakers, who agitated for the abolition of the slave trade. Well, good for them. Credit to them. But who were their primary objectors? Who did the people that argued against the Quakers? It was their fellow Christians, the vast majority of whom said, no, slavery is totally okay. It's right there in the Old Testament. And you can read the sermons from the 19th century, which I have, and, they're just all over the, moral acceptance of slavery. And, so if you I ask my students, on these kinds of questions of, if you lived in 1850s America, on the eve of the Civil War, would you have been an abolitionist? Of course, they all say, of course I would. I'd be opposed to slavery. It's like, probably not, right? Most of us probably wouldn't have been that way. And same thing, this is the point of Milgram's experiment with the shock box. he got 65%, or 67, 2/3 of his subjects went all the way to 450 volts in a learning experiment. And these weren't just 18-year-old undergraduates. He got people from all over New Haven, Connecticut, in all walks of life, and both men and women, different socioeconomic status. So they all, there was no difference. They eagerly shocked other people all the way up to 450 volts with no qualms whatsoever. I mean, so the point is that, you can watch the films about Milgram's shock experiments. Well, I wouldn't do that. Yeah, well, now you wouldn't because you've seen the film. But we constructed some other scenario where you don't know what the setup is, and you don't know how you would act. And the only thing I can think of, say, going forward in the future, I discussed this in the moral arc, is maybe a century from now, people will look back on us eating meat in the same way that we look back at people who had slaves. I'm not sure that'll happen, but that's what animal rights activists think. That's one of the arguments they make, and that we're blinded to our own prejudices, and we can't see that animals are sentient beings that suffer, and or we just ignore it and pretend it's not real, or whatever we do, put it in logic tight compartments in our brains, and continue about our lives eating meat, just like people who owned slaves never really gave it much thought. Although I don't know how they couldn't, because the fact that you have to have them chained and use whips and punishment to keep them in line has to, at some level in your brain, make you think maybe they don't want to be slaves. I've often thought about this. At some point, does the slave master go, I know this guy doesn't want to be a slave, but I don't care. I own him, or whatever. Of course, we don't know what's in people's hearts, but anyway, that's so. I think we can derive values from facts. The way the world is, the ontology, right? In the best epistemology we have is science and reason. So we should apply it to determining which moral values are right and which are wrong. Sometimes that's pretty easy to do. As Lincoln said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing's wrong. Yeah, that's an easy one. Okay. How about abortion? Well, after a century of massive debate, very heated, charged political debate, we have two positions: pro-life, pro-choice. And I'm not sure there's ever going to be a third or fourth position. I don't think there'll ever be one position, and so we end up with conflicting rights. And, the rights of the woman to choose, the rights of the fetus to live, however you want to configure that. And that's what we end up with. What's the right immigration policy? How many people, what percentage of people do we let in? What about, immigrants that are from war-torn countries, refugees? What percentage do we let? I'm not sure there's a scientific answer to that. It's just democracies tend to do this, autocracies tend to do that. I mean, you can sort of take your pick. So there it gets into the messy ground there. But even there, the idea that democracy is better than an autocracy for answering those kind of questions is a objective truth, and we know this historically. If you give people a choice, they will choose democracy versus autocracy. Would you rather live in North Korea or South Korea? Would you rather live in East Germany or West Germany before the reunification? Okay, so and everybody knows what the answer to that is, and so whether the resolution of the abortion issue or immigration or whatever, that democracy is itself a better tool for answering whatever the question is.
Yeah, this whole conversation about morality was pretty much started by David Hume. The "can't get ought from is." And I've always sort of looked at that and thought about it as a bit of word trickery going on there, because he jumped from ontology directly to action, and while science is proposing there is somewhere in between, which is the time where you spend time to get information. The more you know, the more informed you are, the better decisions you can make. So there is a stage of epistemology in between you understanding a situation as it is and then making decisions on it. And I think that particular theory sort of misses that out, because I really think for Peter Singer, one of our philosophers, actually is an animal advocate, and we understand in animals can feel, and they can feel pain and suffering. And therefore, we can choose to do something about it. So I really do believe morality can be influenced by science, for sure, or at least social conversation, where we have a discussion, and we come up with better versions of our lives. But for it to come from top down to tell you that this is what you should be doing, this is better for you, it makes it completely arbitrary and without a meaning. It's given to you. Dr. Shermer, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I would like to ask you one last question, if you entertain it, please. The hard problem. David Chalmers, again, another Australian philosopher, posed the question. Looks like Down Under always come up with the curvy balls, but yeah, the consciousness, that area where we can't really touch it, but it's there. It's nagging us. It's making you feel that you always something more. It's got to be something more. What do you think of it? Is it there?
What do I think?
Hmm.
Well, consciousness is real. I mean, it's as real as anything, because here we are experiencing it. I don't think there's any reason to doubt that. And so, if for example, I resolved the problem of other minds. That is to say, how do you know other people are sentient and conscious like you are? How do you know you're not the only sentient being, like Descartes, who sends himself in a thought experiment down the skeptical path, where he ends up thinking, well, I don't know that anything is real other than somebody's asking, is this all real? So that somebody, me, has got to be real. And then from there, you build, an ontology. You build an ontology through a rational epistemology, and you end up with something like a real world that is reasonable to believe in. Now, to me, I answer it very simply. I apply the Copernican principle, that I'm not special. The Copernican principle is that we're not special in the universe, whatever, for creation, for evolution, whatever. I just apply it to myself. I'm not special. My brain works the same way your brain does. You have same kind of neural networks I do. Your brain uses the same kind of neurochemical transmitter substances like dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine and on and on. And so if I experience pain, and I see on your face the same kinds of expressions that I give when I'm in pain, it's reasonable for me to assume you're suffering, that you're a sentient being that can feel emotions. It doesn't have to be suffering. It can be, you're joyful and in love, and I know what that feels like too. And the idea that I'm the only one that feels that, and all the rest of you are just figments of my imagination, that's not a reasonable argument to make. So I think the same is true for consciousness. I think it's reasonable to assume we're all conscious. It's clearly, obviously linked to our neural networks, to the hardware. And we know this because if you take away some of the hardware, strokes, injuries, tumors, brain damage, surgery, the function, the conscious element of whatever it is that was experienced in that area is gone. Now, of course, you can get some of it back through physical therapy and training and so on, but that just is rewiring. You're just rewiring the brain. And there's a reason children recover from brain surgeries, from brain injuries, much better than adults do, because their brain is more plastic, which all that's saying is that you can rewire it easier, but you still need the wires for the consciousness. So whatever the explanation is, or turns out to be, it has to be in the wiring. It has to be in the brain, in the neural networks. There's no evidence of stuff floating around in between the synapses that you call mind. And again, mind is one of these fuzzy words like paranormal, supernatural. It's just a linguistic placeholder that we use to call something that we describe what we're doing. Well, I remembered this, or I thought that, or I felt something. Remembered, thought, felt, these are just words, right? We're just using words to describe something that's going on. It's just action. So consciousness, whatever the explanation is, it's going to have to be something to do with neurons firing and actions that result, thoughts, behaviors, and so on. And finally, I think, conceptually, this may be one of those ill-conceived problems, that is to say, like free will determinism. How can it possibly be reconciled? Either you're really free or the world is really determined. What is this compatibilist nonsense that 2/3 of all professional philosophers accept as the answer? Part of it is just how you define these words. And so if you're defining consciousness a certain way, or you're conceptualizing it in a certain way, then it seems almost impossible that, these unconscious molecules that are just traveling across synapses, causing other neurons to fire, how could that possibly result in something like sentience? I don't know. It could be that, and maybe no one knows, and maybe no one will ever know, because when it's constructed that way conceptually, maybe there's some other way to think about it that'll be obvious when we reconceive of it. If I knew what that was, I would write about it, but I don't know what it is. And these are these kind of David Chalmers calls the hard problem. Well, it's not the only one. I mean, there's others like God's existence, free will determinism. Some of these that again, it's not that we're not smart enough to figure it out. It's that we're conceiving it in a way that I think is not getting us to an answer. And so maybe we need somebody, an Einstein, to come along and go, no, let's think of it completely different. There's no gravity. It's just space-time bending. It's like, what? Now picture yourself falling down an elevator shaft, your pin next to you, and it just goes and goes and goes, and the pin is just floating there. That's what it's like to be in space, or, it's just, so the equivalence of space and time and gravity, it's all the same. And it's like, people in his time are like, what are you talking about? But now we all go, oh yeah, of course. Well, maybe there's something like that for consciousness. Somebody will come along and go, no, think of it completely differently. And then, oh, that's the explanation, right? So when's that going to happen? I don't know.
So, I mean, I was going to end now, but I'm really now, it enticed me to ask one last question, because I'm really interested to see if you change your mind over the years. You've talked about how science changed, and it wasn't through the slow evolutionary process that we use in evolution. It's more about paradigm shift. It's somebody who comes with a way to think about something completely in a different way, and that changes everything. Do you think a paradigm shift is still the order of the day in terms of big ideas that will sort of leap us to the future?
The idea of, Kuhn's paradigm, it's a useful metaphor, heuristic, or way of thinking about science that almost never works in most sciences. His model was the physical sciences, astronomy. It doesn't usually apply to most other fields. And even, Einstein, I mean, he didn't refute Newton. Newtonian mechanics is still perfectly fine. If you want to get a spacecraft to the moon, Newtonian mechanics will mostly do that. Although I'm told some minor adjustments in the equations with Einstein's relativity helps. But the point is, he's adding to it. He's not refuting it. And it's like Occam's razor. The simpler the explanation is more likely to be true. That's not true. No, not true at all. Particularly in medical sciences and social sciences, most explanations are way more complex than the simpler ones people have that turn out to be wrong, right? Simplicity is not always a good thing in complex systems. Physicists talk about the 3-body problem. Well, how about the 3,000 body problem for understanding why violence happens, or why there's war, or why people commit crimes, or just pick some big social problem, divorce, or I don't know what, alcoholism. Just pick any of those. There's not going to be one explanation. Part of the problem of the replication crisis is that it was all these attempts to just offer a simple explanation. Oh, it's the power pose, or it's the mindset, or it's, the priming of this or that, and the worldview, and too simple, way too simple. It's never that simple. There's always so many exceptions to the rule that the rule becomes useless.
Dr. Shermer, I've enjoyed this conversation like no other. I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity. And I was wondering if you have any last comments or anything you'd like to say to the Middle Eastern viewers that are watching us at the moment.
Oh, well, gosh, I'm sympathetic to the tensions in the Middle East. I understand why, they're there, as we said at the start. You have two guys with a deed to the same piece of land, and each of them is holding that deed in trust with God. And how could that ever be resolved? I don't see how, through religion, and when it's a sacred value like that people define themselves by, really hard to give up anything. And so there you just have to, try to move it in a direction away from religion. In general, though, I guess I would say, whatever your religion, whether you're religious or not, or even if you're a fundamentalist of any faith, you should still embrace science and reason as the best tools we have for understanding the world. Why not think of it as whatever it is we discover in science, that's the way God did it. That should be acceptable. That's what Newton argued. Darwin made a similar argument, although he didn't end up being religious. He was an agnostic, but he couldn't see why people couldn't think of natural selection in particular and evolution in general. It's just that's how God created life. That's how it happened. And so to me, instead of saying, you should give up your religion and become, a humanist and follow the tenets of science and reason, just believe whatever you want on religion. Just follow the tenets of science and reason and see where they lead. If it leads to somebody giving up their religion, okay, that's fine. But if not, that's okay too. We need everybody on board to solve, big social problems. And, for that, we need everybody to be thinking like a scientist.
Fantastic, Dr. Shermer. I really like to thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
I did. No, this is very good. You're very sharp. And yeah, we've pretty much hit the biggest questions of all.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and hopefully see you in the next episode, probably next week. Goodbye.